Boston has long been celebrated as a hub of learning, but there's one educational institution that was sometimes overlooked despite the high regard for the quality of its graduates. Gibbs College in Boston closed around 2008. It was founded a little more than a century ago by Catherine Gibbs, and the school set the standard for skilled office workers. Our guest was a member of the faculty and has written a history of the school. The title is Beyond the White Gloves. We'd like to welcome Rose Doherty. Rose, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for this opportunity.
In the short version, this was a secretarial school, but more than that. But what is this business about the white gloves?
Well, we're going to move beyond white gloves because while the public has seen white gloves and Catherine Gibbs as synonymous, it in fact made women reduce them to a pair of white gloves. The reason that I named the book Beyond White Gloves is that Catherine Gibbs had an extremely strict dress policy. So much so that people could recognize Gibbs students on the street. And no problem at all. Even long after the time of hats and gloves, people still could recognize Gibbs students. So we moved beyond that because, first of all, having gloves and hats in the 70s simply was not an acceptable thing to do. And we also moved beyond it because women became professionals. And professional women are what Catherine Gibbs School was all about, but it didn't start that way.
Well, I grew up in a generation where it became widely believed that women were meant for better things than just being secretaries. But take me back to the history of the school, because this begins at a time when it was hard for women to become secretaries, no matter how qualified they were.
Indeed. When Catherine Gibbs began the school in 1911, women were not secretaries, men were secretaries. And women, if they were hired in an office, were hired as typewriters. They were named after their machines. And it simply wasn't acceptable for a woman to be a secretary. So Catherine Gibbs started off her school as a co-ed school, because at age 46, she found herself in an uncomfortable situation. She was widowed with 2 sons to support, no income, and so she started a school. She started the school for men and women, which doubled the potential students for her. And the reason she became the head of a school for women is the United States entered World War I. And when they did, all of the eligible students, male students, were drafted. So this woman who, a Providence Journal reporter said, never had a marketing class, never went to college, but boy, she had a good sense of self. What she did was she made it into an all-women's school. No one else thought to do that at the time. And so she is thought of as the person who pioneered women's education and secretarial education. And that is not the situation at all.
Well, as you suggested, there were some women who got jobs because there weren't enough men around. But at the Gibbs School, we're talking about women who got jobs because they were better than women coming out of other schools. So explain the difference.
Well, this is very interesting because the curriculum that Catherine Gibbs taught was exactly the same as everyone else's curriculum. English, typing, shorthand, filing, office procedures, exactly the same. The difference between Gibbs and every other place was the standard that Catherine Gibbs set for her students. They were to produce quality work all the time.
Now, explain what quality meant, because the students who learned how to do this, they said this isn't so much a school as a boot camp.
Indeed.
It was brutal.
Indeed. It was brutal. And every graduate will tell you just how brutal it was. And in fact, according to Gibbs law and lore, I have not been able to find the actual source for this, but according to Gibbs lore, a father said that he thought he was sending his daughter to a finishing school. And in fact, it was a boot camp. And graduates will talk about how exhausting it was, and how a woman who became a U.S. ambassador under President Reagan, who had only a Gibbs education, she said that any job she had after Gibbs was easier than the Gibbs training itself. There were only 2 kinds of work that could be produced, mailable and unmailable. So a misplaced comma, a misspelling, and a apostrophe out of place, no good. Now, did everyone achieve perfect work? Of course not. They were very human, but boy, they kept trying. And that desire to produce perfect work all the time is the work ethic that Gibbs graduates bring to today's workplace too, because there are still many Gibbs graduates out there.
I imagine there's quite a range of things that the graduates of this school did. At one end you have the mechanical, but I think at the other end there must have been some women who, even under the title of secretary, were maybe a good deal more than what we think of as a secretary.
These women used being a secretary as a way into higher jobs. For example, the first female editor of People magazine is a Gibbs graduate. The woman who became the first female president of Colorado Women's College was a Gibbs graduate. CIA operatives were Gibbs graduates. These women, many of them had very good college educations, but there simply was no place for women in the workforce. One woman told me that, in fact, when she started working in the early 40s, one of the gentlemen she worked for stood every time she came into the room, which is a little bit of a burden for someone who was working as a secretary at that point. But these people moved on to the executive suite.
That's one of the things that I was a little surprised to hear, that this is not just a place for women who finished high school and couldn't go to a regular college. There was recruiting and students brought in from the most prestigious women's colleges.
Well, in fact, one of the things that Catherine Gibbs did was she advertised at, for example, Barnard. The Barnard Bulletin every week had a Gibbs ad, and there was an ad that said, very cleverly, a limited number of places will be available for very talented people. And she brought those people in, and those people then went on, because for a long time, even after it became illegal to discriminate against women in the workforce, it was still hard for a woman to find a place. For example, the executive producer on David Letterman was a Gibbs graduate. When she finished college, she went to Hollywood because she wanted to have a career as a producer. Well, it didn't work out that way, so she came back. Mother said, go to Gibbs. She went to Gibbs, learned how to type, was hired by the Letterman show, and eventually became the executive producer.
Now, this is a school that adapted to changes, especially in technology. The student body became co-ed. So we still need office skills, mechanical and human. But so how explain why this school couldn't keep up enough to keep going?
Well, I think we have to go back to the white gloves, because in the public's mind, Gibbs was associated with a certain kind of job, and it was a job that by the 70s was no longer respected, which is really too bad, because of course, yes, every office still needs the same kind of administrative skills that Gibbs taught. Whether the person was a secretary, an administrative assistant, general manager, or president of a bank, same skills.
Thank you very much for being with us.
You're quite welcome. Thank you so much.
Rose Doherty, and the book is Beyond the White Glove.